You know, the cross is probably one of the most famous symbols on the planet, right? We see it everywhere, and we kind of think we know the story behind it. But what if there's a whole other way to look at it? A theological framework that reframes the entire event not as a legal payment for sin, but as a guaranteed restoration of the entire cosmos.
And that's really the big question we're diving into here. What if the whole point of the cross was something bigger, more inclusive than what many of us were taught? We're going to walk through a specific theological framework that tries to answer this very question, and it's built on a pretty different interpretation of some key ideas in Scripture.
So first things first, this framework really challenges our conventional ideas about punishment and substitution. It starts by asking two really simple but powerful questions. Who was actually doing the punishing on the cross? And what was Jesus' role in the whole thing, really?
Okay, let's get right to the heart of it. The view many of us are familiar with is that God punished Jesus and that Jesus died instead of us. That's substitution. But this framework flips that script. It says no, it was humanity that punished Jesus, and he died as us, our perfect representative. And that tiny little word change, from instead of to as, well, it changes absolutely everything.
This verse is kind of the linchpin for this whole idea of representation. I mean, think about it for a second. If someone dies instead of you, well, then you're alive, right? You were spared from death. But this verse says that because one died, consequently all died. That only really makes sense, this framework argues, if Jesus' death wasn't something we were saved from, but something we all participated in through him as our representative.
Now, for this whole idea of representation to really click, we've got to take a step back and look at a really key word in a different light. When we hear the word sin, we almost always think of it as breaking a moral rule. But this framework goes back to the word's original Hebrew meaning, and it's a bit different.
So the Hebrew root for the word sin is chata, and it literally means to miss the mark. Think of an archer shooting an arrow and completely missing the target. A more practical way to think about it is just waste. Anytime something doesn't meet its intended purpose, it's a form of waste. A tool that breaks, food that spoils, it's all missing the mark.
And of course, not all waste feels the same, does it? If you drop a cheap plastic cup and it cracks, it's a minor annoyance. But shattering a priceless crystal vase, that feeling of loss, of waste, is just so much greater. So in this view, the scale of the sin or the waste is directly tied to the value of the thing that was lost.
So how can one miss fix another? Check out this simple analogy. Imagine you're at a store and the cashier accidentally gives you $10 too much change. That's a miss, an error. You get home, realize what happened, and go back the next day. You buy a coffee and you intentionally miss the mark again by overpaying by exactly $10. That second miss, that second waste, completely cancels out and restores the first one. So the big question is, how does this principle, this idea of waste canceling waste, apply to something as massive as the cross? Well, this framework basically scales that exact same concept up to a cosmic level. Okay, so if the scale of the waste is determined by the value of the thing being wasted, what would be the greatest, most profound act of waste imaginable? It would have to be the destruction of the most valuable, most perfect, most original being in all of creation. And this is where the source material we're looking at puts it so bluntly. The key phrase here is original of creation. By framing Jesus this way, the act of his murder isn't just a historical tragedy. It becomes, in a theological sense, the absolute peak of cosmic waste.
And this is where a kind of paradoxical, divine logic comes into play. Just like that second miss at the cash register fixed the first one, this framework says God uses the single greatest waste in history to neutralize all the others. It's like what the prophet Isaiah said. God takes the scarlet red of all of humanity's accumulated misses, adds the crimson red of the greatest miss of all time, and the result is the pure, spotless white of total restoration.
Okay. But this whole idea of a cosmic do-over, it brings up a massive question, right? How is it even possible, legally, spiritually, for one man's death to represent all of creation, every person, past, present, and future? The answer in this framework isn't so much about what Jesus did, but about who Jesus is. His unique identity is really the key that unlocks this entire concept of universal representation. The key is in the Greek term logos, which is used to describe Jesus. In this theological view, the logos is God's creative original. Now, this is a really crucial distinction. He's not the creator himself, but rather the first and foundational creation,
kind of like the master blueprint from which everything else is then formed. Let me try to break this down. Picture it like this. God's first act of creation is the Logos. Then, in the second act, everything else, the entire universe, every person is created within the spiritual reality of that original Logos. So, because all of creation literally exists inside him, he's not just a sample of it, he's the container for the whole set. That's what makes him its one and only perfect representative.
And that's the final piece of the puzzle. That's why his actions have such cosmic weight. When the perfect representative of the old creation died, then the old creation that he contained and represented died right there with him. And so, when he was resurrected into a completely new kind of life, that became the absolute ironclad guarantee that everything he represents, which is all of creation, will eventually follow him into that exact same new life.
All right, let's pull all these threads together. At the end of the day, this framework is telling a fundamentally different story about the cross. Let's just quickly recap the 4 core counterintuitive ideas we've walked through here.
So, first, it was humanity, not God, who did the punishing. Second, Jesus died as our representative, which means we all participated in his death, rather than being saved from it. Third, God used the single biggest sin, or waste, in history to cancel out all the smaller ones. And finally, all of this leads to one big conclusion. Salvation isn't just an offer or a possibility, it's a guaranteed, already accomplished fact for all of creation.
And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If this framework holds true, what changes? What changes if the central story of Christianity isn't about fear and judgment and avoiding punishment, but about hope and inclusion and participating in a cosmic restoration that's already been guaranteed for everyone and everything? It reframes the cross not as a symbol of divine wrath, but as the ultimate proof of a relentless, restorative love that, in the end, will leave absolutely nothing and no one behind.